band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. You're probably wondering what this setup's for. Well, Gargoyle released a video recently, so this is a video response to, do you need strength to cut with a sword? And while this may not be a complete one-to-one thing, make sure both this and myself are in frame. As someone who's also studied the workings of hema, I thought I'd add a bit of my own kind of hypotheses, as it was. Now, generally true, if you have a good sharp blade and you have good technique and edge alignment, you can let the sword just kind of free fall, and it should, in theory, cut through the bottle, or at least cut into whatever it is you're trying to cut. But there are certain situations where you do indeed need strength in order to perform a cut. And as Gargoyle said, when you're cutting against bamboo and the like, yes, but what about human flesh and gambeson? Now, for those of you who don't know, a gambeson is a type of cloth armor that is many layers of linen or cotton cloth that have been stacked up on top of each other, sewn together, and layered, and it's very cut resistant. Alright? Swords like the falchion, and not this type of long sword, more like my cold steel bastard sword, those types of wider cutting bladed long swords were designed specifically to cut through gambeson, even though most of the time when gambeson was one of the primary armors, it was arming swords that it went up against most of the time. But when do you need just pure hulking strength to perform a cut? Well, the only example that comes to mind is when you need pure brute strength to perform a cut is when you're trying to cut off a human limb or decapitate an opponent. Now, honestly, swords are not really designed for decapitational strikes, but they can do them. And you're probably wondering, again, what's with this rigging setup? Well, this is going to demonstrate two things. One, it's going to allow me to simulate swords clashing. And two, allow me to show you how you can use minimal strength to perform strong techniques. So, example, me and my opponent, we are in the bind. My weak is against his weak. For those of you who don't know, the weak and the strong of a blade are basically, the lower half is the strong, the upper part is the weak. This is because up here, your opponent can easily control your sword versus down here, where they have a lot harder time and a lot more resistance. Hence, the strong. Most of the time, you want to try to block with the strong and cut with the weak. I know how that sounds, but sword terminology. Now, we're in the bind. I could just brute hulking strength my way through the bind, alright, so I could get into grappling distance with my opponent. That's an instance where strength can become an advantage. Mainly, whenever you want pure hulking strength on your side is when you're in an active dueling situation. Alright? And biomechanically, no matter how much you let the sword just kind of free fall when you cut, you are, by the very biomechanics of your body, putting in strength in the cut, even though you're not meaning to. The only way you can literally let a sword cut on its own is by putting it in a free rotating pivot and letting its own weight do the cutting. Now, back to the bind. Now we're in the bind as it is, and as I said before, I could brute force my way through the bind and get to him. Or, what I could do is, I can let his sword slide, basically skit across my blade, disengage the bind, and then come around. And this is an actual hema technique. The argument of longsword versus katana boils down to, yes, a katana is a little more restrictive, but it tends to have a little higher cutting power, and a longsword is a little more free in its ability of motion, but lacks that little extra oomph of cutting power. Is basically what it boils down to at the end of the day. But see here, it doesn't take a whole lot of strength to allow a sword to free skid across the blade and then to spin like so. Now, Gargoyle has said this before, that he doesn't study hema. He took fencing classes and he's in a kenjutsu class, which is mainly the reason why, as my entire way of fighting with a blade is a hybrid between classic kenjutsu and classic European hema. So, because of my I would say I know slightly more about hema than Gargoyle, simply because I actively research it more. Not to say that Gargoyle doesn't know more than I do. He obviously does, especially about classic kenjutsu, because he actually takes a real class. I can only elaborate from what I've studied of my own. But as I said before, you can brute force your way out of a bind and then kind of just pommel strike. But it's a lot easier to just use very little motion and strength and cut your opponent. Now, I mentioned that the time you really want brute strength on your side is when you're trying to cut into a human leg. This is why I brought up Gambesson earlier. In medieval Europe, before the 14th and 15th century, where plate armor became much more widely available, most of the time people would be augmented in segmental plates. They would have a piece of plate armor here, a piece of plate armor there, but the most common type of armor was chainmail and Gambesson. Usually the chainmail was mainly for the upper part of the body, or they would have chainmail pants. In any case, those were still more well-to-do off soldiers. Your common foot soldier would be more in tune armed with pretty much just a Gambesson and maybe a helmet. And this is where brute force comes into play, because if you just let the sword free swing against Gambesson, even if it's a razor sharp blade, it will not cut all the way through the Gambesson. It will cut through a few layers, but that's it, because the sword only has its own weight and its own inertia behind the cut. However, when you put that same sword in the hands of a swordsman and have him cut into the Gambesson, it cuts far deeper in and does far more damage. So, the times I would say you want to put a lot of strength into your cuts is when you have an opening and you can take it, is when you're trying to cut through thick padded cloth armor or human limbs and torsos. Now, in our modern world, we really don't have to worry about this, since nobody fights with swords anymore, unfortunately. Hashtag bring back judicial dueling. Alright, there'd be a lot less people getting offended if they knew that if you offended somebody, you had the unfortunate chance of having your head lopped off. Of course, most judicial duels were to first blood, which means first one to lay a little snap cut on somebody wins. And Gargoyle mentioned this as well, that sometimes you're not trying to kill the opponent or seriously injure them. Sometimes you just let the sword free swing, and that's enough. All you gotta do is cut a little bit, and they're basically down on the ground. This is mainly in the judicial dueling scenario, like I said before, where two people would square off, completely equal, both using the same weapons, both using the same armor. It'd be a fair, judicial, legal duel in this instance. And most of the time, all you really had to do was just kind of snap cut or cut to first blood. That's all that was required, is just bypassing your opponent's blade and delivering a little sniping cut, and you'd win the duel. Now, there are times that these judicial duels did go to the death. Not all the time, but sometimes grievances were so fierce that the only way to recompense was death. But that's pretty much all I had to say. I decided to make this video while my thoughts were still clear and coherent in my mind. So until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons, and tell me if you agree or disagree in the comment section below. And on a little side note, Gargoyle, if you want to get into hema, I would actually suggest trying to learn messer fighting. It's the closest we have, it's the closest in hema. Messer and falchion are the closest kind of blades we have in hema to katana. So, that's all. I'm out. Peace.